In the second half, we'll have two responders to Darian's paper. Chet Spellman from Cedarville University will give a response, a 20-minute response, and then Dr. Robert Yarborough from Covenant Theological Seminary will give a 20-minute response.
All right. Thank you, Darian, for your paper. Appreciate the opportunity, invitation to participate in this discussion. I'm well aware of my position in this collection of pillar scholars from the New Testament field. So I'm the perhaps the third John of this collection up here. So, all right, my response is called a collection of discrete but interconnected remarks on Darian Lockett's letter from the Pillars Apostles. All right, so in this paper, I will seek to examine a number of salient points in Lockett's book, Letters from the Pillar Apostles. There are several things that Lockett accomplishes in this work. In my view, Lockett has demonstrated the presence of the Catholic Epistles as a canonically significant unit early in the history of interpretation. In his exegetical treatment of these 7 compositions, Lockett has also clearly shown the interpretive value of reading these books in light of one another. So the lingering questions and comments that I have relate to methodological assumptions about the origin and nature of these connections. 1. Connecting history and hermeneutics. Lockett's work seeks to organically connect the formation of the canon to the function of the canon. Accordingly, studying the New Testament canon in this approach will require historical and hermeneutical modes of inquiry. His work here also seeks to problematize any facile account of a strictly linear development between distinct phases of composition, collection, canonization proper, and consolidation within communities. The overlap of these categories seems to be an important feature of the type of canonical approach to the New Testament letters that Lockett espouses. What is hermeneutically significant is not only the composition of these letters, but also the way in which they were collected and received by earlier and later communities of readers. This point relates to the first part of the formulation that historical investigation is necessary in order to understand the meaning of an ancient literary text. A canonical perspective, though, asks several critical questions of a historical critical approach. Does reckoning with the occasional nature of the New Testament epistles necessitate historical critical reconstruction, a generally historical focus, or even the use of background information to generate the interpretive setting of a text? Here the issue is not whether historical analysis is used, but rather the manner in which it is utilized. In this account, a historical approach remains necessary as one pursues an author's intention and also the formation of the collection in which it finds its home. A preliminary step in canonical analysis seeks to outline the process by which an individual text becomes associated with a larger literary collection of texts. In this vein, Lockett proffers the historical insight that biblical texts enter the biblical canon by way of groupings or collection units, rather than as individual compositions. This important mediating step is sometimes missing in accounts of the relationship between the history of the canon and the hermeneutics of the canon. Focusing on this grouping of individual texts within a broad understanding of the canon formation process will influence the way that one speaks about the effect of the canonical context on the interpretive task. The book of Acts is an excellent example of this feature of the discussion. The way in which you relate the book of Acts to the gospel narrative of Luke will influence the way you view this book in relation to the fourfold gospel corpus and also the New Testament letters. Moreover, whether or not one relates the Catholic epistles directly to the composition and canonization of the book of Acts, for example, would reframe how any historical reconstruction is envisioned. In the course of his study, Lockett makes a strong argument for the close relationship between the book of Acts and the Catholic epistles. The critical point in the formation of the New Testament canon that has relevance for the Catholic epistles, then, would not only be the moment when each of these individual letters join the New Testament collection broadly conceived. Rather, the critical question would be the nature of the Catholic epistles collection itself on the one hand, and then its connection to the book of Acts on the other. In relation to the broad shape of the New Testament canon, the further question would then be about the nature of the relationship of Acts plus Catholic epistles unit to the grouping of the fourfold gospel, the Pauline letters and Hebrews, and finally the Revelation. Regardless of your answer to these specific historical questions, Lockett's points seem to be well established and well taken. If this is how the canon formed, it will certainly affect how the canon functions, or at the very least, might function for the reader that takes canonical realities into account. As Lockett notes, holding canon and scripture together allows for understanding the entire canonical process, from composition to canonization, as historically interrelated and hermeneutically significant. Number 2, maintaining methodological modesty. One of Lockett's central claims is that the canonical context is an appropriate further context for reading these letters. Lockett does argue that the canonical context is necessary, but does not thereby jettison the need for historical analysis. Indeed, as mentioned before, an emphasis of the approach on offer here is the attempt to connect the composition phase to the canonization phase of these writings. Nevertheless, Lockett strongly states that the canonical context is both legitimate and necessary for proper interpretation of these writings. As he states, these 7 letters should be read taking both their individual historical situations and their literary and theological placement within the New Testament as crucial for their correct interpretation. Lockett acknowledges at several strategic places that historical investigation is necessary. However, he also argues quite directly that a historically oriented approach is not sufficient. It is integral to crucial research steps, but not adequate for a full understanding of these writings. Speaking in this manner immediately raises the question, sufficient or adequate for what? For Lockett, the meaning of these letters initially influences and is subsequently influenced by the canonical context of a 7-fold letter collection. In this scenario, there is something of a give and take relationship between the interpretation and reception history of these texts. This argument is a direct and meaningful one, but it is also a relatively modest claim. Lockett does not seek to reposition the meaning, much less the authority of these writings, to a subsequent phase of canonization. Likewise, he does not propose that the historical critical analysis of the text's origin and prehistory is meaningless. Rather, Lockett positions historical analysis as the starting point rather than the culminating apex of the interpretive task. This approach is modest because it does not involve the exclusion of historical analysis per se, but rather relegates the prehistory of a text to the preliminary phase of investigation. The historical occasion of the writing or the historical reconstruction of the background of the author and recipients can play a requisite role here, but not a governing one. In Lockett's approach, the role of historical analysis includes identifying and analyzing the recontextualization of these historically conditioned writings within a canonical subcollection and ultimately within the context of the New Testament broadly conceived. Again, historical investigation is necessary here, but that necessity relates to properly locating the individual writing and also perceiving its recontextualized role within a canonical collection alongside other biblical writings. Though Lockett challenges a standard historical critical approach, the use of historical analysis described here should demonstrate that this canonical approach cannot be rightly labeled ahistorical, or even that it has an aversion to history or historical critical examination of the relevant evidence. Indeed, even directly historical critical tools serve an indispensable purpose in providing the depth dimension that is necessary for a reader to perceive the guiding and governing function of a canonical collection. 3, examining the notion and nature of collection consciousness. One of the signal proposals that Lockett makes regards the notion of collection consciousness and the appropriateness of its application to an understanding of the formation and the function of the Catholic Epistles. The analysis of the paratextual and textual features of these 7 letters provides compelling indications that the believing community read and understood these letters as part of a coherent collection. This then seems to locate the notion of collection consciousness among the community of early readers who receive, collect, and pass along these writings. A question perhaps prompted by this analysis is, what is the relationship between a collection consciousness among the believing community and a possible collection consciousness among the biblical authors themselves? Would making this move require a different set of assumptions or a shift in terminology? To the point, when Lockett speaks of compositional evidence of a collection consciousness, he generally describes textual features, verbal links, and thematic corollaries between the letters. A question for Lockett at this juncture might be, which of the areas of this investigation might indicate a level of collection consciousness directly at the compositional level? In specific instances, when Lockett sidesteps this question, is this due to the constraints of the study, or is this a measured argument about what can and cannot be discerned in this area? A corollary point of discussion that arises particularly when we begin to speak of pressure put upon interpreters who read individual writings within the context of a canonical collection relates to the viability of the notion of canonical intention. In this vein, Lockett's overall conclusion is that the Catholic epistles should be read and interpreted as an intentional, discrete, canonical subcollection set within the New Testament. He further notes that a collection consciousness is neither anachronistic to the meaning of the letters nor antagonistic to their composition. In other words, the larger literary context of the Catholic epistles was perhaps unforeseen by these authors, but not necessarily unintended. He also notes that one need not pit composition against canonization or authorial intention against the intention or intentions of the canonical compiler or redactors. A more sophisticated account of intentionality, Lockett insists, can incorporate the intentional acts of authors, redactors, and compilers, such that understanding how the combination of these various intentions transcends yet never leaves behind the intentional acts of any individual part. End quote. A further development and articulation of this component of Lockett's approach would strengthen the methodological framework that undergirds his historical and interpretive work. Lockett navigates between the historical and hermeneutical issues of canon formation throughout the volume. A lingering question that might be worth pursuing is which theological categories are necessary for this canonical approach to the Catholic epistles and the notion of canonical intentionality. Which theological confessions fund and underpin a canonical approach in general, and to these letters in particular? In other words, is the appeal to intentionality at the level of the collection a way of speaking about the motives of the communities that gather biblical texts into collections, or is it a way of referring to the general theological categories of divine inspiration and providence? 4. Exegetical payoff, an issue of meaning or context. Another question that plagues the methodological discussion of canonical interpretation regards the differences that these distinctions have or do not have on the hermeneutical task. What tangible impact does this approach have at the interpretive level? One of the central textual observations that Lockett develops in this book relates to the use of Leviticus 19 in James and 1 Peter. Both James and 1 Peter contain direct citations and allusions to this Old Testament passage. Further, the message of Leviticus 19 seems to inform the opening argument of both letters. When Lockett later identifies the group of central themes in the Catholic epistles, he argues that the love command is particularly prominent in large measure because this theme is implied and shaped by the strategic use of Leviticus 19 in both James and 1 Peter. The way that James and 1 Peter utilize the concept of exile or diaspora also features into Lockett's exegetical analysis. In the opening of both writings, the theological identity of the Jewish and Gentile communities is directly associated with the notion of exile. Here, Lockett contends is theological identification rather than solely an ethnic or geographical designation. An order of reading that reflects the sequence James and then 1 Peter amplifies the fecundity of this associative link. The question raised at this point is if the compilational logic of this collection unit might cohere with the compositional logic of these individual texts. What would be the best way of describing the nature of this textual connection? Does the ordering of James, then 1 Peter, generate this connection, amplify independently established patterns, or does it represent a happy coincidence of arbitrary positioning? For Lockett, the verbal, thematic, and structural connections between the openings of James and Peter are suggestive of an intentional juxtaposition of the two texts by the community of first readers. As he positions the interrelation, a striking profile of textual features within these two writings provide baseline warrant for a compilational juxtaposition. In this way, the relationship between James and 1 Peter is not only fitting, but they have also been fitted into this relationship by means of the canonical process. Moreover, this fittingness would likely have been recognized by close readers who would have received and assessed these two texts. In this way, Lockett's notion of collection consciousness represents a thick account of mere contextuality. In this reading, seeing the connection brought into view by the canonical context of the Catholic Epistles is not only valid, but it is also vital for a full understanding of these New Testament epistles. How would this framework affect not only the meaning of individual compositions, but also the way in which these letters interface with the rest of the New Testament? In other words, if James and 1 Peter are understood to be members of a canonically significant subcollection, would this affect the way that they interface with broader literary and theological trajectories within the New Testament? So thinking of the broader horizon of New Testament theology in this vein, these letters would organically engage in a textual dialogue with one another, but also interface with other New Testament theological trajectories as a group, rather than as literary lone rangers. What's at stake here can perhaps be seen if we consider the analogy of the schoolyard game, Red Rover, Red Rover. Because why not? If Paul were to say, Red Rover, let Jude come over, the postcard epistle of Jude would almost always be dwarfed and perhaps enveloped by Paul and his formidable and multifaceted letter collection. However, if Paul were to say, Red Rover, let the Catholic Epistles come over, the textual and theological playing field would shift and the interactive nature of the game would be modified. Jude would then dialogue with broader features of New Testament theology alongside of James, Peter, and John. Paul, in other words, would be picking on someone his own size. In this canonically contoured conversation, the letters of Paul would find a complex but complementary dialogue partner in the letters of the Pillar Apostles. In this scenario, writings like James and 1 Peter would function as individual compositions in their own right, but when these letters dialogue with the broader New Testament canon, they would do so in the company of their respective subcollections. And finally, number 5, subcollections as a prevailing context for biblical writings. As a final point of discussion, I note that Lockett's argument and approach to these 7 letters individually and in light of one another demonstrate the enduring relevance of the concept of collection as a legitimate and warranted category of analysis. David Trobisch argues that the interpretation of the New Testament writings necessitates a consideration of the groupings and ordering patterns that appear in the earliest manuscripts of these writings. Lockett's work illustrates the merit of this observation and represents the type of historical, theological, and hermeneutical fruit that can come from this type of analysis. As a solid work of scholarship, Lockett's study answers questions and establishes starting points for viewing the Catholic epistles as an appropriate hermeneutical framework for interpreting New Testament letters. It also raises questions and prompts areas for further research that would need to be pursued and developed in order to realize the full yield of this approach to the New Testament canon. These areas would include carefully considering the exegetical soundings that Lockett has proffered and asking questions like, which direction does the intertextual electricity flow within these literary works? Lockett provides a blueprint for navigating a fresh entryway onto well-worn pathways and also shines a light on several genuinely new textual trajectories. So, in conclusion, in this response, I've attempted to articulate an appreciative interaction with some of the central planks of the methodological framework that Lockett constructs in this volume. In my view, the canonical approach in general and Lockett's proposals in particular have a strategic role to play within the broader field of New Testament studies.